Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conflict and Resilience Research Institute's Transformative Dialogue webinar titled Duty to Prevent Genocide in Ukraine Impact on Negotiation for a Just Peace. This is our last episode in this series presented by Dersia Sant. Today, I'm very delighted to see so many of you are here for a conversation that sits at the intersection of law, ethics, and peacemaking. Before I go into the context of this episode of the webinar, let me do the treaty recognition. The Institute is based on the original lands of Anishinaabe Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We all are treaty people, and we are all promise bound to work together in the true spirit of truth and reconciliation. The audience, for your information, on 30th September, we celebrate Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is right around the corner. We meet on a pivotal day today. The 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly opened its general debate today in New York, 80 years on from the founding vision of peace, development, and human rights that still challenges us to do better. Moments ago, and in the run up, world leaders sketched sharply different paths. For example, the UN Secretary General warned, and I quote, of an age of reckless disruption and relentless human sufferings, unquote, urging a recommitment to cooperation and the rule of law. Meanwhile, the US President emphasized nationalist responses, calling for closing borders and some of the ideas and policies based on which United Nations was founded in 1945. These contrasting frames capture the stakes of Ukraine and for any international norms more broadly today. The audience, our focus today is the duty to prevent genocide, not as an abstraction, but as an active obligation shaping diplomacy and the terms of any future settlement. The International Court of Justice made clear in Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia that states must employ all means reasonably available to prevent genocide, calibrated to their capacity to influence those at risk of committing it. That jurisprudence defines prevention as proactive and graduated, not optional or retrospective. Applied to Ukraine, this duty intersects with the ongoing International Court of Justice case Ukraine versus Russian Federation under the Genocide Convention, proceedings that have drawn dozens of intervening states and continue to shape the legal landscape surrounding Russia's claims and the conduct of hostilities. Whatever emerges at the negotiating table, the convention's obligations and the court's authority are already part of the fabric of any durable outcome. Because our title emphasizes a just peace, let me underline what that means in practice according to peace practitioners like us. A just peace is not merely the cessation of fire, it's a settlement that centers survivors and civilians, including the disappeared, displaced, and those subjected to atrocity crimes. It affirms territorial integrity and the right to return, coupled with reparations and truth seeking. It embeds accountability mechanisms from domestic prosecutions to hybrid or international avenues so that impunity doesn't become the price of quiet. And it locks in guarantees of non recurrence, including security arrangements and deal monitoring of hate propaganda and atrocity risks. In other words, prevention duties and peace negotiations are not competing agendas. They are mutually reinforcing. Prevention clarifies red lines, justice provisions transform those red lines into verifiable commitments, and together they move us from pause to peace. Finally, a point of moral clarity as we gather today. In New York, what we saw, President Volodymyr Zelensky has reiterated that all deported Ukrainian children must be returned today, not bargained over tomorrow. That demand has been a consistent red line in Ukraine's diplomacy around United Nations General Assembly Week and broader talks, echoed in recent statements and initiatives such as Bring Kids Back UA and international efforts to secure repatriations. Let me close my opening remarks with a frame for our discussion. On the eve of United Nations General Assembly's 80th, we are reminded that multilateral norms are only as strong as our willingness to live by them when it is hard. For Ukraine and for the integrity of the Genocide Convention itself, prevention cannot be deferred to the post conflict phase. And peace cannot be purchased at the expense of truth and accountability. Our speaker will help us today to test, and that means for diplomacy, security guarantees, humanitarian corridors, and justice pathways. Thank you for being here, dear audience. On behalf of the Institute, I invite you to engage candidly, bring your questions to the question and answer session, and help us think through how a duty to prevent lens can shape, not sideline, the pursuit of a just peace. The audience, we are also delighted to, I would say, reintroduce, because you have attended two of our wonderfully crafted webinars past 2 days. Darcia Sant is also with us today, and she's a Canadian lawyer called to Manitoba Bar in 1988 and Ontario in 1993. Most recently, General Counsel and Director of Policy and Ethics at the Law Society, and she retired from there. A longtime profession builder, she has served as a Bencher Life Council member of the Manitoba Bar Association, chair of the CBA Ethics and Professional Responsibility Subcommittee, and co-chair of the Federation of Law Societies Access to Legal Services Exchange Group, among other national roles. In 2024, she retired to study in the Netherlands and earned her LLM degree in Public International Law from the University of Groningen. She is now focusing her work on public international law and is a member of Canadian Lawyer for Ukraine. It's wonderful again, Darcia, to welcome you for the third episode. And we are so grateful that you have put your energy in this very contemporary topic. And I'm really hoping that our audience are enlightened and educated because you were talking about some of the technical aspects of this issue. So without further ado, space is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kauser. And yes, I hope that although it's a complicated topic because we're dealing with legal issues and law is typically not black and white or straightforward by any means, I'm hoping that by dividing this up into 3 sessions, it's hopefully more manageable to take it in 3 sessions. With some very distinct topics. And just to wrap up a little bit further from what you've just indicated, and thank you for those opening remarks. We all know that genocide has been called like the crime of crimes, but we can also see that there are multiple genocides arguably happening around the world at this time. We mentioned that yesterday. And as important as it is to ensure accountability for those who commit genocide, it's extremely important to try not to even get to that point, obviously, where you're worrying about charging somebody or a state with committing genocide as a crime, because we should be doing all we can as states to prevent the commission of genocide in accordance with the Genocide Convention, the duties we talked about at length during the last session, and in accordance with the guidance that was subsequently provided by the International Court of Justice in the Bosnian genocide case, which set out the standard of due diligence. You can go to slide number 1, please. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to be focusing on a few specific topics. One of them is how it's challenging to wage peace during what may be described as an ongoing genocide. States must play an important role in any peace process. So we'll be talking about that and how they can do that, and by continuing to take all measures to stop the commission of genocide. And we're going to consider the risks associated with any peace proposals that fail to respect and implement international law principles and norms. We can go to slide 2, please. So when looking at the forcible transfer of children as a separate act of genocide, remember we talked about there has to be an action, the actus reus, and the intention, mens rea. But in the case of genocide, we need a very special intention, a high bar to meet, dolus specialis, meaning that the act is not only, the perpetrator not only intends to commit the act in question, but also intends to basically destroy in whole or in part one of the groups that we have discussed in the convention. But it's important to notice in another respect that Article 2E, relating to the forcible transfer of children, is quite different from all of the other acts of genocide set out in Article 2, which included things like killing members of the group or causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, etc. And I would like you to think about why it's different, because if you consider, imagine tomorrow there's a ceasefire, and imagine within 2 weeks there's actually a fully negotiated peace agreement on certain terms. I won't say fully negotiated, but terms that people seem to be, at least in principle, in agreement with. In that scenario, if missiles are flying, you would expect that, of course, they will stop flying, that there won't be the targeted strikes that we've seen with multiple missile attacks and drone strikes each and every night in various cities in Ukraine. That would stop. That would be the expectation. And of course, that would be the expectation. But what about the children? And this is what I'm going to be talking about this evening, is that this is a very distinct and different category, an act of genocide, because when a war is ended, the children haven't been returned. And it's important to consider that in that respect, it can be described as an ongoing genocide. So even in a time of a peace settlement, there can still be an ongoing genocide because of the forcible transfer of children to Russia and Belarus, etc. And that's important to remember, that genocide can happen in times of peace or in times of war. So if we had a time of peace right now, without the children being returned, arguably that is a continuing genocide. It might be helpful to consider a concept from criminal law, national criminal law, relating to the crime of kidnapping. You can go to the next slide, please. For example, in various states, the offense of kidnapping is an ongoing offense. That is, the act of physically taking the person is not the entire actus reus of the offense. In fact, in 2021, the England and Wales Court of Appeal in the Criminal Division, in a case called Dean versus R, considered a key issue concerning the nature of the offense of kidnapping, namely whether kidnapping constitutes a continuing offense. Well, why were they considering that? It's because in that case, the appellant, remember this is an appeal court, contested her conviction for kidnapping, arguing that the offense was not a continuing one, and therefore she should not be found guilty for participating after the initial act of kidnapping. She relied on an earlier case that suggested kidnapping was complete once the victim was taken and carried away. However, the Court of Appeal disagreed and dismissed her argument. In doing so, the court aligned its position actually with a Supreme Court of Canada case called R versus Vu from 2012, affirming that kidnapping is a continuing offense and holding that participation in subsequent actions such as driving a victim away and being aware of kidnapping is progression and can result in criminal liability. We can go to slide 4, please. So in that sense, the forcible transfer and the ongoing continuation indoctrination of Ukrainian children after they are transferred, coupled with the failure to repatriate them, may then be viewed as an ongoing or continuing genocidal act. Why? Because the affected children can still be located and returned. They continue to be separated from their state and their next of kin. The genocidal act did not end as soon as they crossed a state border. As one scholar notes, the various measures that the Russian Federation has taken by changing legislative processes so that people could become guardians and allowing for the faster adoption and giving them passports, that all of those measures, this scholar says, enabled a legal bond between the displaced children and the new national group. It's not a temporary thing. At the same time, a cultural, linguistic, and educational integration takes place. Children live in Russian families. They obtain a Russian education. Everything is done for them to consider themselves Russians. Therefore, until forcibly deported children have been returned to Ukraine, I submit that really a genocidal crime is continuing. States, therefore, when you think back to that due diligence standard, they should be thinking on an ongoing basis, doing those risk assessments we talked about during the last webinar, to determine whether the Russian Federation has plans to carry out more forcible transfers of Ukrainian children, and if so, how a state's awareness of such plans may continue to impact their legal duty to prevent genocide. For example, the Institute for the Study of War, which is Washington-based, they recently reported, or a few months ago, that Russian occupation officials continued to develop plans and talk about plans for the forced removal and deportation of tens of thousands more Ukrainian children over the course of just this past summer. The Institute contends that those summer camp programs are intended to indoctrinate and militarize Ukrainian children, eradicating their Ukrainian identities and instilling pro-Russian, hyper-militarized sentiments in them, really to create the next generation of loyal Russians and erase what would have been the next generation of Ukrainians. Recently, a variety of states have attempted to use diplomatic efforts to initiate conversations aimed at achieving peace, and that's very commendable. But in light of the due diligence standard relating to the duty to prevent genocide, I submit that it's insufficient to propose terms of peace agreements, including the need to address border security issues, whether a border will stay the same or not, while the crime of crimes may be continuing without assessing and addressing that grave and ongoing crime. As attempts are made to facilitate dialogue that may lead to peace negotiations, states should take concrete steps to ensure that genocide is actively addressed in any peace talks. Let's consider what happened several months ago in the spring once the second Trump administration came into being. Soon after he took office, President Trump directed a significant shift in foreign policy that affected the geopolitical landscape, and in particular affected relations between Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and the USA. There were telephone conversations back and forth between Trump and Putin without representations on phone calls or meetings with anyone from Europe or Ukraine. There was an apparent broad agreement to pursue three goals: to restore staffing at respective embassies in Washington and Moscow, to create a high-level team to support Ukrainian peace talks, and to explore closer relations and economic cooperation. Around that time, unfortunately, Trump also blamed Ukraine for starting the war, even though it was the invaded state. And there were concerns raised in various media outlets and journalists reporting that what President Trump was doing was simply repeating what are commonly called Kremlin talking points. He also made it clear that the US was keen to normalize state relations with Russia and create economic partnerships even in the face of an otherwise united West on the need to maintain sanctions against Russia. And in addition to exerting pressure on Ukraine to enter into a minerals agreement with the United States to repay aid that was previously provided by the US to Ukraine, the Trump administration began to propose settlement terms that would end the war on terms that would effectively reward Russia for invading a sovereign independent state, an action that is in clear breach of what is the foundational principle on the use of force contained in the UN Charter. Next slide, please. On April 6th, in its ultimate peace proposal, the US proposed that it would recognize Crimea as territory de jure belonging to the Russian Federation and large swaths of eastern Ukraine as de facto Russian territory. The proposal also required Ukraine to surrender territory that was captured by force. Sorry, you can go to the next slide. I missed one. Okay, that's where I am. And of course, requiring Ukraine to surrender territory that was captured by force also amounts to a breach of international law. And it stood in direct contrast to the USA's own 2018 Declaration on Crimea, where the United States said that it rejects Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and pledges to maintain this policy until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. It's notable that the focus of the US proposal was on the control of land and on economics. There was no mention of the return of children who had been forcibly transferred. And ultimately, that what was referred to at the time as the ultimate US peace proposal was in fact rejected by both Ukraine and Russia. And there's a reason why I'm talking at some length about the United States, because of course it is a large state power. It has the means to project its economic and military capabilities in ways that any other state really cannot. And therefore, it has the capacity to effectively influence genocidal actors in ways that other states do not have that capacity. And on the one hand, the US seemed to embrace its outsized role, if you will, on the geopolitical stage, with Trump stating he could end the war on day one of his second term in office. On the other hand, his administration complained that EU member states have not contributed as much as they should to Ukraine. But the duty to prevent genocide does not translate into mathematical formulas that outline on what basis states should act when there is a risk of genocide. Next slide, please. Under the circumstances that I've described, it's, I submit, very difficult to reconcile the significant legal obligations of states to cooperate with other states using their unique capacities to influence, to take all measures to prevent genocide, with peace settlement proposals that do not prioritize or address at all the return of Ukrainian children. Peace proposals not addressing the repatriation of stolen Ukrainian children impact not only the tens of thousands of children who have already been forcibly transferred. You must consider that these proposals that don't prioritize or even mention the children also impact approximately 1.6 million Ukrainian children who are in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, who are also at risk of deportation and Russification. Trump himself stated that he believed he could exert pressure on Putin to return the Ukrainian children. In a conversation with President Zelensky, he actually promised to address the issue of Ukraine's missing and abducted children. However, as I noted in the webinar yesterday, the US also halted the funding of the laboratory that was doing a comprehensive investigation into identifying the locations of these stolen children, and that's the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. The funding was pulled. A bipartisan bill was tabled in the US Senate not that long ago, urging that all Ukrainian children abducted by the government of the Russian Federation be returned before finalizing any peace agreement. I just looked on the status of that bill today, and it looks like it's been referred to a committee. It hasn't yet been voted upon. But I'd suggest that other states should consider tabling comparable resolutions in their respective legislatures. And states should still continue the potential effectiveness of exerting collective state diplomatic pressure on Russia to prioritize the repatriation of those children. I understand from reading a news article just dated September 19th, just a few days ago, that the US Senate is advancing a bipartisan bill to label the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terror And that designation would impose further restrictions on Russia, although some have commented that the impact of such a bipartisan bill, if it is in fact passed, may be limited due to existing sanctions that are already in place. But still, it steps in the right direction. Next slide, please. The United Nations General Assembly, that, as Kauser mentioned, is meeting this week, in December, just last year, adopted a very broad resolution relating to multiple issues, including the forcible transfer of children. That resolution contained strong condemnations, and I know that people get weary of condemnations without action. But again, when you're working in diplomatic circles, you work with what you have and you continue to persevere. It's a long road, and you can't give up after one conversation that may go sideways or not the way you would like it to. So those strong condemnations were still important. But they also called for some concrete actions. That resolution called for Russia to immediately and unconditionally reverse the decision to simplify the procedure for obtaining citizenship for Ukrainian orphans or children left without parental care. It called on Russia to provide a comprehensive list of the names and whereabouts of all children forcibly transferred or deported, including those who were subsequently adopted or transferred to foster families, to ensure that those children are provided protection and care in accordance with international law. Because, of course, it's beyond the scope of these webinars to even begin talking about Geneva Conventions and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are all sorts of other conventions pertaining to children's rights that have been trampled in this horrible situation. But we're focusing on genocide. They also said that Russia should cease its forcible transfers or deportation of Ukraine's children and take all steps necessary with a view to their safe return and family reunification in line with what do we always talk about? The best interests of the child and in accordance with international law. The Russian Federation has not complied with that resolution. Next slide, please. To bring pressure to bear on Russia, states could consider imposing additional sanctions. And it's been suggested that those additional sanctions really should be taken out against individuals and entities that are specifically involved in the kidnapping and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children, as identified by Ukraine. Also, a white paper produced in 2024 by the Bring Kids Back Ukraine Task Force, which is actually co-chaired by Baroness Kennedy, contains other concrete recommendations for the international community to support the efforts of Ukraine's government, including by demanding that Russia and its allies strictly comply with their obligations under international law, including and especially the temporary character of any forcible transfer of children and the need to respect voluntary and informed consent. Again, when looking at intent and what was really intended by these abductions and transfers, any kind of transfer under international law is supposed to be on a temporary basis, and certainly not to the aggressor state, to a third state that's neutral and in accordance with consent being properly given. So states could be putting pressure on Russia collectively to do these things. They also recommended that states negotiate with Russia for access to any and all forms of available data on forcibly transferred or deported children. That would include existing registries, any records of name changes, because they know that names have been changed, granting Russian citizenship, etc. Another concrete action, they said that states should negotiate to provide access for international missions to temporary placement centers throughout Russia and anywhere else where these children have been taken. Let others in. Let the international community into these places. They should negotiate with Russia and its allies to cooperate with the European Network of Ombudsmen and the European Network of Ombudsmen for Children on the possibility of visiting the reception facilities throughout Russia. States should support national efforts at retracing, returning, and reintegrating Ukrainian children who have been taken. States should apply existing international and regional mechanisms of judicial and non-judicial forms of accountability. That would include things such as economic sanctions, asset freezing, travel bans, and related measures that are all available to the international community. And it's important to know that and keep in mind that states can take all of these concrete steps, even in the absence of any active peace negotiations going on. What are states waiting for? States could take and press for steps to be taken now to pave the way for the repatriation of abducted children. It wouldn't be an easy task by any means. And in fact, there's numerous challenges every day that this war continues and the children are not back with their rightful families and guardians. They are at risk of being ever more indoctrinated, of forgetting their families. Some of the children were taken as babies. They would actually never even know their family. So it's not going to be an easy task in any event. So why aren't the states doing what they can now to pave the way for those actions that really should take place later? Slide 10, please. Commenting on the continuing the concerning escalation in Russia's campaign to abduct and Russify Ukrainian children, in May of this year, the U.S. Helsinki Commission issued a statement including that the acts we've been talking about are a serious violation of international law and, I'm going to focus on these words, amount to war crimes and genocide. They said Russia must stop these criminal acts. And notably, in light of the topic of our webinar this evening, they said the protection of Ukrainian children living in occupied territories and the return of those forcibly taken to Russia and Russian-controlled areas should be at the forefront of any peace plan. One scholar has noted that peace agreements have frequently referred to and deferred to international humanitarian law, which is sometimes called the laws of war, and also international human rights law, and more recently, also to international criminal law, requiring parties to the agreement to comply with obligations under those bodies of law. When considering the legality of proposed peace agreements and whether they would be valid under international law, the concept of coerced agreements should be considered. Next slide, please, Kauser. For example, the main legal obstacle to any peace agreement requiring Ukraine to make concessions to Russia is found in Article 52 of the VCLT, which is the short form for the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And it states, a treaty is void if its conclusion has been procured by the threat or use of force in violation of the principles of international law embodied in the Charter of the United Nations. As one scholar has argued, Ukraine would never voluntarily allow Russia to take control of large swaths of its territory, nor would they agree to give up their aspirations to join NATO, certainly not in the absence of a comparable, equally effective kind of an agreement, security agreement. And this scholar suggested, therefore, that any peace agreement requiring those kinds of concessions relating to territory would fall, arguably, under this Article 52 of the Vienna Convention, rendering that kind of an agreement void. In addition to considering the potential illegality of territorial and other bargains made possible through coercion, it's imperative, I submit, to examine the legality of a peace agreement that would effectively require a state to ignore its own international law obligations. Consider the following. Ukraine has an obligation at law to prevent genocide of its own citizens. It's clearly made the repatriation of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children a priority. Consider that if Ukraine were compelled to enter into a peace agreement that does not unequivocally address the need for the children to be returned, it would have the effect of requiring Ukraine to lay down its arms in the face of an ongoing genocide. Ukraine cannot reasonably or legally, I submit, be forced to ignore its own international legal obligations to take all measures necessary to prevent genocide or stop its commission. Accordingly, any peace proposal that is forced upon Ukraine and that fails to require the return of those children may be void at law. And what's the consequence of that? Of course, that would therefore fail to advance a just and sustainable or lasting peace. Next slide, please. On February 24th of this year, which was actually the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution demanding an early end to this war of aggression and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. So the goal is to achieve a just and lasting peace. Therefore, if that's the goal, in an effort to achieve that goal, peace negotiations and settlement agreements should respect and reflect international law principles so that we don't have peace at any cost. And I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Darcia. Thank you so much. What a brilliant way to put it. And I think our audience have realized that forced upon peace agreement is technically void, according to your research that we have just heard. And especially, I would urge upon our audience to follow this track and also follow the development, what is happening around the peace agreement in the future. The audience, we have a few minutes left. I do want to ask Darcia a question, and this is related to children displacement and civilian protection, of course. The question is like this. President Zelensky insisted that deported Ukrainian children must be returned immediately. What concrete mechanisms, like legal, diplomatic, or technical, can achieve rapid and verifiable returns? What do you suggest, Darcia?
Well, I think that some of the concrete actions that were suggested in that white paper through that committee co-chaired by Baroness Kennedy give some concrete examples of things states can do to bring that about. It's one thing to demand their return, but unless you have a list of where these children, first of all, the ones whose names have been changed. So get those lists, demand them immediately. As I talked about earlier, you have to pave the way for the repatriation. You can demand the immediate return, of course, and he's passionate about that, as am I. But practically speaking, whoever asked the question is correct. You have to take concrete steps to get there, unless President Putin just folded and said, okay, I'm going to send them all back, which I don't believe is going to happen. I don't think anybody believes that's going to happen. And again, there's risks of the ongoing, continuing transfer. So there's many layers to this complex problem. States should be putting pressure to make sure there aren't, let's at least stop the flow. Let's turn off the tap and make sure that this isn't going to continue to happen and tear more children away from their families. And then follow the recommendations that we can have white papers, but if states don't show the willingness to get together, because collective pressure is typically better than pressure from one, although depending on who the one is, and again, depending on shifting geopolitical landscapes, it's becoming apparent that with the shift in foreign policy demonstrated by the US and this current administration, that others will likely step in and fill that void. That can be a good thing. That can be a not so good thing, depending on who's ready to jump in and fill the void that's being left at that international level. So I think as citizens, what can you do? Well, I think that citizens have a lot more power than they realize. You have members of parliament. You can write letters. You can phone. You can say, where are these negotiations going? What is Canada's role, for example? I know that today at the UN General Assembly, there was a side meeting that was co-chaired by our Prime Minister Carney with President Zelensky. But follow up on that. Was it talked about that as part of any peace plan, This has to happen as part of the plan so that it's not forcing Ukraine to breach its own international legal obligations. Use your voices, use your fingers on a keyboard, pick up the phone, do what you can, pressure your own MPs to pressure. There are things that citizens can do. They can have rallies, they can meet, they can do webinars like this, they can all sorts of things. You're not powerless. And it's important to really remember that.
Wonderful, Darcia. Just I would say, a minor question in a sense that are you hopeful because today U.S. president has remarked that Ukraine can gain all the lost ground, and do you think it's a paradigm shift from United States in terms of geopolitics?
I am very cautious to comment on that kind of a shift. There was such a seismic shift over the last few months, and even with the almost constant, in 2 weeks I'll make a decision to do something, in 2 weeks I'll make a decision to do something, and that's stretched into months. That would be wonderful if that shift could go back to the way it was, to normalize the geopolitical landscape. Because things change literally daily, it's difficult for me to feel right now a lot of faith in that. Again, it would be wonderful if that were to happen. In light of those words being said, I think every other state, though, should capitalize on that and strike while the iron is hot in case it changes next week, and put pressure as you can. Yeah.
Thank you, Darcy. Thank you so much. Maybe a last question from my side, but this is just related to just peace theory and the debate and discussion that we have in our area. So, if I ask you to name three measurable benchmarks to judge whether any agreement is on track towards a just peace, uh, I mean, consider yourself drafting a peace agreement. What are the three, four things that you would like to see reflected in a hypothetical peace agreement, which might be workable and practical?
Mhm. Well, I think they should have an immediate ceasefire, again, to stop the killing, the maiming, all the harm that's being done, both to civilians, soldiers, infrastructure. I think that there should be, of course, an end to what I'm calling an ongoing genocide, that has to deal with the repatriation of those stolen children. I think that there has to be serious consideration given to, I understand that there's been perhaps some discussion about whether there would be any waivers in terms of not going after individuals who have committed atrocities, going after them in terms of having them charged criminally. And again, is it just? Is it the word justice? What does that mean? And of course, from all of your extensive work in the area, it can mean different things to different people. And certainly, if you speak to Ukrainians, what does just peace mean to them? Well, they want freedom. They want assurances that this isn't just going to happen again. Let's have a peace agreement, and in 2 years, there'll be another invasion. No. So I think any peace agreement has to have very concrete, defensible, effective terms in place to make sure that they don't just get their freedom for a year or two, but that they can continue to enjoy that freedom that they've fought and died for. So I think those particular aspects, and of course, reparations is another very touchy issue. There's billions of dollars that are being held frozen. And I know that there's been some movement on the European front about possibly dipping into that. But that would be something very important, because how just is it if Russia can just go home tomorrow and not have to pay anything for the billions upon billions of dollars of damage that has been done? And I know that there's been a reparation of damages registry that's already been set up. So I think that would also be important to include.
Fantastic. Very well articulated, Darcia. I don't have any further question. And as typically we ask you to kindly conclude And just, I mean, would like to hear from you as a scholar in this area, as a practitioner, because you understand the nitty-gritties of the law more than anybody else around us. And you have beautifully laid out these three-part series, and the crafts of the law in the international arena. So, in your conclusion, we would like to listen from you. What do you expect in the future? Are you hopeful? What are your fears as well? And I'm going to put up the slide as you requested. Go ahead.
Okay, well, in terms of briefly concluding these three webinars, I think it's clear that genocide is taking place in Ukraine. I'm concerned that there's not a lot of discussion by states using that term, whether you're talking about the forcible transfer of children or every other act that we went through on the first webinar. There's killing, there's clear deprivation of things that people need to live. Why isn't there further discussion? And there should be. And we can't just say, well, the word is being used too often. It's being used lightly. I think we've tried to, in the course of these webinars, to explain that, no, it's not a term to be used loosely. It's a very specific term. It's a very specific crime, a very special crime with a special intent that's required. Nobody's suggesting that there doesn't need to be a rigorous analysis, but in undertaking that analysis, how can we not say that genocide is taking place? So, and of course, the duty to prevent genocide. I was reading something in the paper the other day that there's some elected officials seem to be stating that they don't have to come out and name something as genocide until the International Court of Justice, for example, actually rules on a situation and calls it a genocide. And if that was an attempt to say, well, we don't have the power, because we're not a court, we don't have the power to call it a genocide, we have to wait for the courts to do that, I agree with that. But I'm concerned that in the way those kinds of comments are made, it's not accurate in the sense of states have a duty to prevent genocide. And all of that law and the due diligence standard that we talked about, due diligence, the obligations to do something before you ever get to having to ask a court such as the ICJ, is what happened over all these years, genocide. Let's stop it. And there's a separate duty that states have to prevent it. There's not nearly enough, I think, emphasis on that. And I believe it's essential for the preservation of what we call the rule of law, that states demonstrate, as you talked about earlier, the political will to comply with legal obligations. Because you can have all the laws in the universe, you can have treaties, but unless you follow the terms of your treaties and don't breach them, unless you have the political will to act in accordance with your international obligations, the words on the piece of paper don't mean very much. And when facilitating negotiation of a peace agreement, again, that's very admirable. I think states should be encouraged to do that. But they must not lose sight, as part of that process of being like a third state, of state obligations under international law, nor ignore Ukraine's own international obligations, its own legal obligations, and somehow compel them to accept peace, in quotation marks, when there are huge risks at law that peace agreement would unravel. And again, is that just for Ukraine if they're going to be facing the same aggression in a few years? Next slide, please. I think it's reasonable and legally defensible to insist upon an end to ongoing genocide before concretizing the terms of any proposed peace settlement. So not that you can't enter into the discussions, but before anybody signs anything, insist on the end to that genocide. And again, that might take a long time, but if it's in the agreement, there are ways that you can make sure that it's followed through on. And really, if there's to be any hope for Ukraine to have a just and lasting peace, negotiations themselves and any ultimate agreement really must demonstrate respect for and adherence to international law principles and norms. because without that, we're not upholding the rule of law. And without that, we're in chaos.
Thank you very much, Darcia. Once again, what a beautiful conclusion of the series itself, and of course today's webinar. And the audience, it is difficult to summarize what Darcia she has been presenting for the past three webinars. However, I just want to make two very brief comments. Listen to her presentation carefully again, because these are available in our YouTube channel, and we are going to also share, just to remind you that these are worth listening to in our social media feeds. So ongoing genocide, children, and just think about this staggering number that various organizations have already put up: 1.6 million children. And think about the complex nature of this act. Even if the war ends, peace treaty occurred, people are happy. Out of 1.6 million children, can you ensure 1.6 million have returned back to their homes? Impossible, I think. You see, a segment of children are already lost because of this conflict. And who's going to be responsible for those children? My second point, the audience, for you is that Darcy is very clear. She's a specialist in terms of law, and now she has a well-reputed degree in international public law. So she's saying that you can have so many treaties, etc., etc., but without the political and moral willingness, how do you expect these laws are interpreted and executed? Because that is the ultimate reflection of the resolution of an issue, not the laws and resolutions and diplomatic efforts in General Assembly and year after year. That is important to be kept in mind. And finally, thank you to our speakers, those who have tuned in the past and today, and to everyone who joined and engaged so thoughtfully. We set out to examine how the duty to prevent genocide should shape negotiations for a just peace in Ukraine, and a few anchors are clear. Prevention is not a postscript, it must guide diplomacy now. A just peace is more than silence of guns, it requires truth, accountability, reparations, and return of the displaced, and, as President Zelensky underscored, the immediate return of the Ukrainian children. On the eve of 80th UN General Assembly, with global norms under visible strain, the choices we make about Ukraine will echo far beyond this war. Our institute will distill today's insight into short briefing notes and share resources from our panel presenter. And please stay connected, subscribe to our updates, circulate the recording, and keep pressing for policy solutions that align prevention with peace. On behalf of the Institute, thank you for spending this time with us, and let's carry the clarity from today into the work ahead so that justice is not traded away and peace, when it comes, is durable. And on behalf of the Institute, we'd like to express our deep gratitude to Darcia Senft for taking all the troubles and preparing for this three-part series. And if she is willing, we can decide whether we can share her slides in general, in some way or forms. Thank you, Darcia. And dear audience, lastly, this part of webinar we have transmitted broadcast as of today is was made possible by the support of Rotary Club of Winnipeg during the Peace Days Festival 2025. Please do follow Peace Days website and schedules, www.peacedays.ca, and you will find wonderful events are happening in our beautiful city of Winnipeg. And we welcome all of you to follow some of those. And of course, these recordings are kept in our YouTube channel and social media feeds. Feel free to go back, and if you have any questions, also please write there, and we'll convey it to our presenter, Darcia Sept. Thank you so much. Stay well and stay tuned. Bye bye.
Thank you. Good night.